Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you happen to stance in this dialogue with the ongoing incredible introspection of the new Untouchables. And this is episode 33. We're recording this on Friday, August 15th, 2025 at approximately 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And I am joined by June Carbone, the Rabina Chair of Law, Science, and Technology at the University of Minnesota. And as always, I'll put links to her information below in the description. And joining us as well, of course, is William K. Black, a gentleman who needs no introduction, but someone who I like to always impart, just continuously gives us his time, his effort, his energy, given 30 years of being in the trenches of white collar fraud and, quite frankly, corruption at levels that would surprise a lot of people, considering what a lot of people are finally getting hip to now. And I think I want to start this dialogue, Bill, just aiming this question at you. I happen to, well, I think I'll set the table first. Obviously, on this Friday, we're looking at Trump Putin summit in Anchorage, Alaska, when earlier this week, Donald Trump didn't even know he was going to Anchorage, Alaska, among other things. In addition, of course, this, executive power over the Washington, D.C. Capitol Police and everything that's involved in that measure. But one thing that was and constantly seeping into my feeds and things that have just been confounding me is that it looks like there is a concerted effort by the Trump administration to target elected officials from primarily, obviously, just the Democrats, but from both Congress and the Senate, in a concerted effort, not to mention other elements of complete overuse and abuse of, I guess, just the executive presidency. But in the context of what we've been talking about over the course of the last many weeks and months, quite frankly, is something that I don't think I've ever qualified, but I want to do it with the ramp up to this. Kind of a unitary Supreme Court in a sense. So it's something where the court doesn't operate, especially with the shadow dockets and things that we're seeing, within the regularity of law, for example, at least that which we've grown to accustom and accept over the course of many decades of my life. And to that point, I think there's an actual legal terminology as it relates to this impact called presumption of regularity, of which judges are not holding Trump's overreach to account. And in this context, Bill, I recall the story having been targeted and threatened by the former CEO of Lincoln Savings, Keating, who sued you for $400 million. Now, that was a long time ago, but at the same time, that's an extraordinary amount of money. But can you kind of capture this monstrosity of this government trying to bankrupt people that are a threat to it within the Department of Justice, Congress, and the Senate? We saw obviously Alex Padilla arrested. So please, it's extraordinary.
Okay, so we've emphasized that we need to restore democracy, but we also need to restore the rule of law. By restore the rule of law, we don't mean that there isn't a legal system. There is a legal system, and the phrase for what you've just been describing is lawfare, as in warfare, right? That you can use the legal system with its presumption of regularity, fancy judges in robes and all those good types of things, talking in hushed tones, often writing in relatively hushed tones, that put people to sleep after the first paragraph. But what they're doing is no longer applying the rule of law. They're using the law as a weapon. And they do it for several purposes. The primary purpose that you've seen is intimidation. So intimidation is designed not only to intimidate the specific target, but everyone else in their position, right? So you don't have to sue every university. You don't have to sue every big law firm that you want to bend to your will. You just have to sue several of them. And then everybody else gets the message. You are signaling that there is no rule of law, that under the quote unquote legal system, they will use it to break you. And there's a quotation attributed to someone, to my friends, everything, to my enemies, the rule of law, the law, not as justice, right? The law. And law has, in many people's minds, still this ability, even when it's perverted, to disgrace the opponent, right? So there's some implication that you must have done something wrong and that you shouldn't listen to those persons. So it has both the intimidation and it has the potential to discredit. And of course, it has the power to bankrupt. And that's just the civil law. In the criminal law, you've seen geared up in recent weeks all these quote unquote investigations to potentially bring criminal prosecutions against the political opponents. All right, so this is a very old thing, and it's not currently in use simply in the United States. It's being used in scores of countries as we speak. Uh, a whole series of elections and non-elections where you don't have a need anymore to have an election because you discredited the press and frightened it and your political opponents in many countries has been decisive in keeping people like Trump and Putin in power. You mentioned Putin. Putin is a criminal on every conceivable dimension you can think about, right? He is a criminal in the sense that he's corrupt. He may be among the 10 richest people in the world, right? No one can know because back to that intimidation and the fact that there is no real rule of law, right? So my stuff is secret. Your stuff, I have the power to get information, plus I have the power to make things up. And then I have my not real press, right? The freedom of press nominally stays in existence, but they're simply a tool again. Another form of warfare, another form of disgracing your opponents and bankrupting your opponents and getting information and to spread again the fear that just stay in your homes, stay quiet, don't fight back. And of course, that's what our agenda is designed to do is to show how to fight back. Yes, this happened to me, but this happened to many other savings and loan regulators and other honest regulators as well. They threatened to, they being the Reagan administration, threatened to bring a criminal prosecution against the head of the agency. I've explained this a number of times on the grounds that he was closing too many insolvent savings and loans. Now, of course, you're supposed to close insolvent savings and loans. That's your job. But these were politically connected, and that's another point. It isn't just the head of state. The heads of state create predatory networks, and the predators, most powerful predators, create predatory networks from the private sector. And these networks overlap dramatically. In other words, they have many of the same participants are part of the private kleptocrats, predatory network, and part of the network of Putin, the network of created by a Trump. And therefore, again, you can loot with impunity. And that was what was going on with these Texas savings and loans in our case. They had done the political contributions. The Texas delegation was immensely powerful, included eventually the Speaker of the House and a very powerful Jim Wright, a Speaker of the House. And so you could use those people to protect your fellow thieves in your predatory network and to assault anyone that was going to come after them. And so democracy dies, Markets die. There's the appearance of markets, but it isn't real, right? It's a rigged system. You've heard that phrase from both sides for decades, and part of that's reality. But there's not been the equivalent of a Trump in the history of the United States of America. The old discussion about whether it was the Grant administration or the Harding administration that was the most corrupt, they're all pikers. Trump is off the charts. But the guy he views as more powerful than him, the one he's desperate to have the respect of, that's Putin, the guy who went before him and showed him how you can use these powers to take a great nation and turn it into a corrupt, essentially a mob operation. And that's what they want to do. And that is the ultimate disgrace of six members of the Supreme Court of the United States of America. And yes, they do not play it straight. We can see in the shadow docket, and that what's important there is that you can take critical actions without explaining your actions or showing who voted for your actions and such. And they used it very selectively in the Biden administration in violation of normal rules. Shadow docket has to do with injunctions, um, temporary restraining orders, which are often decisive for much of the process of the litigation. And on the Biden administration nearly always lost on those, even when normal principles, and again, June and I, this is what we did as our specialty at Federal Programs Branch, mostly injunction defenses. So the normal principles would have said Biden would have won the great bulk of those cases, whereas he lost the great bulk of these cases. But they become even more extreme in this term. And I think it's pretty close to unanimous that when Trump wants to get out of an injunction, they use the shadow docket in his favor. Uh, so again, freedom dies in the shadows. All those that doeth evil hateth the light.
That was pretty close to the tagline on our poster for the con, by the way. The American dream dies where power lies. And I thought that was a pretty clever sentiment. June, turning to you, and wow, what an amazing ramp up. And I was just thinking the whole time of like, gosh, shadow just pops up all over the place in this analogy, right? You've got the shadow banking, you've got the shadow docket, you got shadow power all over the place, and the shadow docket is what's I want to tee you up with here because we just I, we saw from 2016 forward that Trump had this incredible fascination with authoritarian leaders, be them. I mean, it wasn't like it wasn't completely public. I mean, he was building everything on this, and then all of a sudden, through the last 6 months of this last election cycle, of course, we saw the run up of the technocrats with Project 2025, and as we've seen this thing post Doge leading up to this summit with Putin this week. I mean, everything we're seeing is what I thought happened in Russia, circa 1998. And so there was news this week of the Russians, or evidence on the front page of the New York Times, of the Russians actually being responsible for getting data, I believe, within inside the courts themselves. I'm not exactly sure how to frame that. Can you pick up on that and
Sure. And I want to put this in the frame Bill is talking about. So, talking about the rule of law. And, I have this law review article with my co-authors, Naomi Kahn and Nancy Levitt, in which we describe something we call legal civil war. And the idea was that the rule of law ruptures when you have two sides, each of whom view the other as illegitimate, and one or the other says, we will not abide by a definitive decision. Well, Trump has said that for years. And Democrats say, oh, of course, we accede to the final decision of the Supreme Court. But we have reached the point where it is time to shout from the rooftops and from the top of the White House, I might add, that this is a lawless regime that is illegitimate, that the Supreme Court is illegitimate. It is important to emphasize the break that is occurring in the academy. I want you to know, even Democratic law professors, unless they're pretty far left, revere the Supreme Court. That's come to an end. You have a new book out by Lee Littman at Michigan called Lawless. That's a description of the Supreme Court. You have my colleague Bill Eskridge, who is at Yale Law School, and we were classmates, has a new article about to come out describing the shadow docket and how one-sided it is. And these are at odds with the things that make courts legitimate. So we need to say, hey, Supreme Court, you rule something? We don't care. You're wrong. Period. You have no authority except that Trump imposes. Now, where do we go with that? Well, I've got a whole list of things that we ought to be talking about. So let's start. The Russians have hacked the federal judiciary. Now, the truth is, you want to understand what starve the beast means. It means there's almost no government that is adequately funded to do the job it is charged with. This is a deliberate Republican strategy. It is, we don't fund you, you're incompetent, we can get rid of you. That was Elon Musk's mindset going into Doge, except he got rid of the parts of the government that actually work. But that's the Republican agenda. They've starved the courts for years. I went for jury duty in Missouri a number of years ago, and the judge was saying, write your local representatives. We only get to pay $5 a day for jury duty. Why? Because they don't give us any money. Tell them to give us more money. The courts need money, okay? But Trump has done two things. The courts were never well funded, and now Trump has said, hey, Russians are committing espionage. Russians are attempting to undermine the operation of the US. Let's invite them to do so. He did so during the 2016 election. But what gets less attention is he has fired the people who investigate what the Russians are doing and offer the defense from it. So now, on the eve of this meeting that Trump desperately wanted, Russians have been shown to hack the judicial system. What does Trump say? Oh, of course, what can you expect? It's Biden's fault. Maybe I'll mention it to Putin. And of course, Putin will do nothing. He'll deny he did it. And then we'll say, oh, I believe Putin. That's what he did the last time. So it's time to yell from the rafters. He's a Russian asset. Note that he doesn't have to know he is a Russian asset. But Putin's wet dream is having Donald Trump, an incompetent, fawning sycophant to him as president of the United States. Even if Trump simply does what Trump is inclined to do on his own, it weakens the United States. So we know, because it's in the New York Times, which means there was a major leak, that the Russians are hacking the court system. What we don't know is why. Is Trump using the Russians? Are they doing it to get dirt on Trump? Are they doing it at his behest? We don't know. We have no idea. Where's the publicity about this? And I think we need to be proactive. So let's take the Nobel Peace Prize, which we know Trump desperately wants. He apparently, and again, I don't know how well sourced this is, but the leaks are that he called the Norwegian finance minister, and we know that's true. And we know he discussed the Nobel Peace Prize. And the rumors are that he also said if he doesn't get it, he's going to impose tariffs on Norway. It's time to announce very loudly in the entire world, hey, if the Norwegians, after a phone call like that, give him the Nobel Peace Prize, let's throw it in the trash. It's worthless. It means nothing when it is the result of coercion. And we can say several other things. I have a whole list, but what he is doing right now in DC, you can see how the DC Council has announced that Pam Bondi has no authority to do what she just did. That's proactive. And I think what is going on in California with Governor Newsome trying to redistrict California. But I want to emphasize what is happening with these moves. They are saying what Texas is doing, what Trump is doing are illegitimate. And when what Trump is doing is illegitimate, we don't have to obey the law either. The rule of law is dead. The Supreme Court is irrelevant. And the question is, what can California do in accordance with California law? What Trump is doing in Texas is a violation of institutional norms. We have to fight back in kind. And we are at that point, and we're beginning to see some Democrats do that.
Well, I'm so inspired by both of you, but that was wild. You know,
Can I amplify
yes, of course.
what we're talking about with these kind of leaks? So the United States, A, has special courts that decide whether you could do investigations, and these courts have been discussed over the course of the controversy about Trump, by the way. So that special branch of the judiciary is ultra conservative in terms of their appointments, and they get all kinds of incredibly classified information as the predicate for launching an investigation. That's one. Two, in regular courts, when they bring cases, what there is often is an attempt to defense by skilled defense lawyers. It's actually a specialty area um, in which they essentially seek to blackmail the United States of America. That you better not, you can release the information showing I'm guilty, but by doing so, you'll basically get agents useless or even potentially murdered and reveal government officials that are secret US sources and such that we've been able to turn and are moles in their government, right? So that gets to all kinds of fights as you begin one of those prosecutions. And what the prosecution does is file information under seal so that the defense doesn't get to see it about the predicate for its actions. And those information under seal, that's why, if you recall the whole discussion about a SCIF, special compartmentalized information, right? Those facilities are the only place that certain documents are allowed. And you are not, for example, allowed to bring a modern phone, iPhone-ish type thing, into a SCIF. These are super sensitive. And those filings, as probably were picked up. In fact, they would have been the leading target of the Russians, precisely those filings. Now, the United States, if people recall, was able to give warnings that the Russian invasion of the Ukraine was imminent. And President Biden decided to go unusually public with these warnings at an earlier point. And there was already concern that that would reveal that we had high-level sources in the Russian government, right, in key positions that were well aware of the attack plans. That was immensely valuable to the Ukrainian defense. Indeed, the only reason there is still a Ukraine is that several weeks of notice and, the incredible bravery of the Ukrainian people and their armed forces. I'm not suggesting that that wasn't the truly critical, but that warning was essential to the survival of Ukraine as well. The Russians are desperate to find who our agents are. And those agents are not just killed, they're tortured first for all possible information. Their relatives are seized, threatened, imprisoned, and all kinds of potential future people that we could get as agents to reveal Russian military attack plans and such will be frightened out of existence. Plus, our allies are going to stop sharing information with us because this will be revealed as well. This is of immense importance, and it's timely because of this idiotic meeting in which Trump is groveling again in front of Putin. So this is a big deal, not a little deal, right? This access to these documents isn't, oh, well, of course, they read the briefs. The briefs are all publicly available. No, it's all these things filed under seal that are among the crown jewels of national intelligence.
Well, I'd like to say I'm shocked, but I guess I'm not. But I gotta try to interpret and provide clarity in my mind because what June had proclamated a moment ago that the law is dead. I mean, to have somebody of your stature, June, say that openly to me is so incredibly powerful and important, and we have to get other people to echo and understand your level of credentials. I mean, we're not Patrick Lovell. I said the law was dead after I had discovered Bill Black and the con, right? I personally, that's where my mind was. Then we saw the insurrection. Then we saw the imperial presidency, and we learned the back door with all things Clarence Thomas and Alito and all of these just insane things. And I've been saying this now for a very long time. And I'm like, where is the outrage? Where are the people pouring into the streets? And where is the clarity moving forward? And on that note, as you had mentioned, June, and I want to address this to you first, Bill, from this standpoint. Look, a lot of people are desperate for leadership. And we saw yesterday Governor Gavin Newsom effectively show leadership by playing dirty in a way, both online with the type of language that somebody like Trump likes to use to demean his people, demean, those like it's a, fifth grade playground, for example, right? But in the meantime, he's got the National Guard, I believe, showing up across the street while they were meeting about this. But as I start to look into the background of Gavin Newsom, and I'm not an expert on Gavin Newsom, I know he's been around for some time and everything else, but just to bear the basics, right? The guy's father was, I believe, general counsel for the Gettys, or within the organization. I'm not sure if he was general counsel or something, but he was an attorney within the Gettys apparatus. Somehow Gavin Newsom comes in and, I think he is involved with a large, I don't want to call it a co-op, but a group of wineries that are involved with the Gettys. And he comes from that billionaire background. Okay. And here's a guy that America, on top of, we see, and you had, basically sent a message to where is Obama drawing a line in the sand several weeks ago. But here's Obama also coming in, and they're talking about obviously the gerrymandering scenario in Texas and what is going to take place in California. But I want to emphasize from the both the fight platform and the it'll come to me in just a second, but the nature and the magnitude of what we're trying to make people understand that it's not just Trump, it's the robber barons, it's the kleptocrats. And so to defeat Trump's, I refer to it as the Mad Magazine Mad King scenario. That's the only thing that can pop into my mind. It's so ridiculous. I mean, again, I want to emphasize Trump didn't know he was going to Alaska to meet with Putin. I mean, in what world does that make sense? Well, the one that we're in the midst of. So can you please address, in the Restore platform is what I was teeing up here, the nature of the kleptocrats and who's really in a position to rise to the moment, given the declaration of what June just laid out. If the law is dead, the United States is effectively dead.
Right. So first, kudos to Gavin Newsom for some brilliant trolling of Trump. And allies good. But I certainly don't want him as our president because he's beholden to a different group of robber barons. And I don't, the whole idea of the restoration is that we actually restore democracy, not just change which group of robber barons is, behind the scenes dominating the government. So that's going on. Um, we think, or I think, I'll speak for myself, that using the whistleblowers and using what they're able to disclose because they know where the bodies and the documents are buried uh, is the most effective way, that can really, yes, fine, public marches, demonstrations, great, but this would feed them with the information on exactly how what's going on, but even more, the demonstration of courage that we're not going to sit back and just let this happen, that whistleblowers are willing to put it all on the line and come forward. And it is insane that the Democratic Party, for example, is not subpoenaing the key whistleblowers to testify in front of state legislatures where the Democrats have a majority and can have that subpoena. And beyond that, it's critical to have the subpoena for technical reasons we've explained. I won't do again in this talk. But once you've done that, you'll be able also to have the whistleblowers give talks, working with folks who are good at narrative, in a 30-minute presentation with an hour and a half of Q&A to audiences in every district in America, every congressional district in America, multiple times, because we have thousands of whistleblowers. Part of that's our fight plan. Our fight plan also is, again, using information often from whistleblowers, but even sometimes where you don't need whistleblowers, is to bring all the meritorious suits you can bring. Why? Because multiple things. One, you're going to win a lot of them, even in front of this judiciary, and you're going to smoke out whether the Supreme Court is going to overturn everything that is hostile to this administration. But secondly, the Trump administration has a crisis in lawyers. The federal programs branch, the U.S. attorney's offices that defend these kinds of suits are suffering catastrophic losses of their best people. So they cannot defend these actions. They simply don't have the people. And this is a pressure point that should be used. Third, it makes the stuff public, right? All the hearings, all the briefs in particular. Briefs are brilliant stories if they're done right by attorneys and such that the news media likes to pick up. And it's a demonstration of courage that we can go forward. But it also means the other side, with its bad lawyers, the few that remain who are willing to lie, will lie. And that subjects them to discipline by the district judges, many of whom are still interested in a rule of law. But it also does by the bar, right? Lawyers have to be members of a bar association. They can be disbarred for lying to the courts. And they can themselves become whistleblowers in the course. You can see the defense lawyers in some cases will themselves become whistleblowers because they'll be ordered to do bad things and such. So again, this is a process in which by showing courage, better things happen and more people are take courageous actions. And again, that underlying point is it's not hopeless. We can fight back. The restoration process is, again, let's not change one group of robber baron rule to another group of robber baron rule. Let's have a restoration plan where we restore the rule of law, what June has talked about, create a Supreme Court that actually enforces the rule of law and enforces the Constitution, and that also will have the process of these things interact of having ever more disclosures. We're going to get whistleblowers not just about what's happening in the Trump administration, but what's happening in the robber baron's outfit. So, for example, the Meta Zuckerberg whistleblower has horrific things that are being done by Facebook Meta that are barely known by the public. This is a high level person who can testify from personal knowledge and explain how it's led to tens of thousands of deaths, for example, in Sri Lanka and other such places. So that's the guts of the restoration plan as well, and why the two fit together so well. We want to fight not just to stop Trump, but to stop the future Trumps, and we want to restore a real rule of law, not just change which group of corrupt folks is in charge.
Well, it takes guts, and that's exactly what you've been doing from the very beginning of joining these broadcasts, Miss Carbone.
Right, but this is the point. The whistleblowers, we don't have to look to the past and old guys. We can look to what's going on where thousands of federal employees are coming forward. And out of the universities, there should be hundreds of people at these universities that have caved coming forward as whistleblowers. And out of the big law firm, there should be scores of attorneys who are coming forward as whistleblowers as well and can explain what the internal discussions were when they decided to show cowardice, the opposite of courage, because they didn't really care about the rule of law when it came down to it. As Mark Dan has often explained, when it came down to whether they would make $20 million a year or $15 million a year, they said 20, even if the price of that was the destruction of American democracy and the rule of law, and basically all moral things that we pretend to believe, and those lawyers pretended to believe and gave innumerable speeches. You could get hundreds of accounts of these folks that did their platitudes to how the rule of law was everything. But as soon as that actually came to them having to bear a price, said, nah, I'll take the money.
The betrayal to me is biblical, and I'm not a religious zealot by any means, but I mean it's just like the metaphors and all of it. June, do you want to just pick up there, or
Sure. Yeah, let me pick up. So I wrote a book in 2010 called Red Families versus Blue Families with Naomi Kahn. And when we summarize what was the difference between red and blue as an ethos in that era, we said, how many conservative Republicans does it take to change a light bulb? Two, one to tell the other to do it. How many liberal Democrats does it take to change a light bulb? Can't be done. One would have to rise above the other to reach the ceiling. Fast forward 15 years, and the Republican Party today stands for one thing and one thing only, and that's power. Once Democrats say the power that Trump is exercising in a variety of ways across the country is illegitimate, then the way you fight back is through amassing counterpower. And let's talk about what that looks like. So I want to give one historical parallel, and that's when we talked about legal civil war, we said there were two classic examples, Reconstruction 1 and Reconstruction 2. The Reconstruction following the Civil War ultimately failed in dismantling white supremacy. When you say why it failed in large part because there was a national financial crisis, a recession, and the Republican Party, then the forces of equality, gave up and let the South go its own way. What happened when you had the modern civil rights movement are two things, and I think it's very important to emphasize that. The Warren Court reversed Plessy versus Ferguson, the precedents that had established separate but equal. And the South screamed, this is illegal. There was a resolution in Congress which most Southern Democrats signed saying, you can't reverse the Supreme Court. The Warren Court is illegitimate. And the Supreme Court and President Eisenhower, along with Kennedy and Johnson, doubled down and said, hey, we mean it. We're the Supreme Court. We're going to enforce our authority. And Eisenhower sent in the troops. Now, the second Reconstruction worked in a way the first hadn't. Why? Because the most prosperous period in the history of the South since the Civil War is the period from 1965 to 1975. What is happening is the South is booming. It's booming because the federal government is spending money on infrastructure and because manufacturing is moving from the Rust Belt unionized North to the non-unionized South. This is pre-globalization. Those plants later move overseas. But the South, the price for Southern prosperity was observance of civil rights. It was win-win. So we need to be thinking about, again, how you discredit the current group, how you yell. Trump wants to talk about Obama committing treason. This is confession and projection. Trump committed treason when he welcomed Russia to look up Hillary's emails and did nothing. Not listen. In fact, he obstructed. That's what Mueller's conclusion was. He obstructed the investigation into Russian interference with the election, which we know occurred. That makes him a traitor. If he wants to call Obama a traitor, let's be clear, Trump is a traitor. And if Trump is a traitor by that definition, he may not be able to be prosecuted, but all of his subordinates can be. And we should be saying that. The U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of New York is investigating Attorney General Letitia James for civil rights violations. Why? Because she investigated Trump. Trump is the victim of civil rights investigations. So let's announce he's going to be disbarred. We want an investigation into him and any lawyer who supports this ridiculous politically motivated investigation. Announce that from the beginning. There will be consequences. But as I've been saying from the beginning, when Democrats take back, when they will have the power to reimpose the rule of law, will only come when the crash occurs. And we should be thinking about how to get ready to say, Florida, you're going to be underwater, literally. You're going to be unaffordable. Who betrayed you? The people denying climate change. AI. Okay, right now, the only thing keeping the economy afloat, according to some people, are these massive investments in AI. But there may be a crack. I mean, AI is going to do a couple of things. First, it's going to drive electricity prices through the ceiling. It's going to do, it may, there are all kinds of things that could happen. We should be talking now. Who are we going to hold accountable for the negative things that happen? So again, there will be an opportunity. I want to emphasize those of us who support civil rights think of the Warren Court as imposing the rule of law enacted by the 14th, 15th, and 13th Amendments. 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th and 15th Amendment guaranteed equal rights. The South has defied that since the end of Reconstruction. Most of us think of the Warren Court as saying the obvious. You can't reconcile segregation, de jure segregation, with the rule of law. Even Antonin Scalia believed that. But the South didn't. You had the civil rights movement to succeed by the imposition of power in the name of justice. And that's the combination we have to be laying the foundation for. The reimposition of the rule of law will only come through the assertion of power, holding those who are defying it to account. But it won't be with their consent, and it won't be with the consent of the current Supreme Court.
Wow. And, I've been saying publicly recently, and I mean, not nearly as eloquently, of course, as the wonderful June Carbone, but I have said if a Democratic Party is not running on, pressing a full campaign against this RICO president, I think that would be a mistake, first and foremost, as it relates to the midterms. But moving forward, in terms of the historical context, because what June, you laid out was just such a brilliant tapestry. We've been here, seen this, done that, and these are these forces that have been at play in American history for a very long time. And, Bill always says there's never an absolute victory, that this battle goes on, and it's not necessary to hope to persevere. But what I was reminded of, Bill, and I want to try to tee you up for this because it is extraordinary, looking at this strange continuity with all things Epstein. Okay, so first and foremost, we know that Trump's mentor is Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn comes out of the time period of, J. Edgar Hoover and all of these incredibly strange goings on at that time period, particularly as it related to the Russia scare, the Red Scare, and things that, seem to be kind of, I don't know, reconfiguring itself in a new sort of, manner from this technocratic impulse. And I think Steve Bannon's on the same page there. But as it relates to all things Epstein, what I've found so fascinating recently is that, when people start asking the questions about where was the money coming from, why was the money there, and you start to get into Towers, which was a Ponzi scheme, I found out just today that I believe Epstein's company was called Liquid Capital. That was part and parcel to a bailout that J.P. Morgan was involved with pre, obviously, great financial crisis when the Bear Stearns domino fell. And the 13 banks that had met with the leadership, because apparently Paulson and Geithner had brought everybody under one roof in an emergency scenario, where he elicited a 3-page document that said, this is what we're going to do and this is how we're going to do it. I didn't realize that Epstein was a part of Bear Stearns at that time period, and just to kind of consider what that looks like when you bail out, or maybe that's not the right terminology, but that was padded into, the strangeness of this liquid capital, right? And all things considered. But that was the first step into what they called Maiden Lane 1, as you recall, right? And so you fast forward and you look at just this lack of accountability, right? In every direction. What we're seeing that people are reacting to in real time is that here are these women that were part of the Ghislaine Maxwell trap, and they were trying to get people's attention for some time. Now, as salacious and horrible as these stories are, and there were girls at the time, but the whole system ignored them. But I'm talking media. The whole system of media ignored these stories, and of course, then there was no outrage and accountability, and we saw what happens with Acosta and these backroom deals and all the strange things. But then you see the money that's involved. And then you see, okay, well, wait a second. What was Chiaffi and Tannen involved with before the great run that would lead to AIG and our friend Paul Peltier? And I mean, I could go on and on and on. What I'm trying to say is this Epstein story for me is the tip of the iceberg as it goes full circle, because then we come full circle to this. And I'm sorry for this long ramp up to this question, but I really hope you can answer this, Bill, because we know Putin was involved with Deutsche Bank. We know Deutsche Bank was a direct elixir to all things Trump. We know, by the way, through that silly story, that it was the Russians that came in and bought that estate right next to Mar-a-Lago that created a rift between Trump and Epstein at that time. But the money and the major players are all over this story, and it looks to me like this amazing amount of global capital was rolling into the subprime scenario that was completely hyperinflating the bubble that you had identified as 50%. It may have happened otherwise, but I'm just going to stop there because I could go on and on. This is weird.
Okay. So, yes, the rule of law, right? This is the shadow financial sector. All these entities that you're talking about in the United States and in Russia, everything is the shadow sector, right? It's a completely corrupt system of oligarchs. And if you upset Putin enough, you end up allegedly jumping out, obviously being pushed out or threatened in such a way that to save your family, you jump yourself, but you're really saving your spouse or mistress, probably in some of these cases, from a 16th floor window. Key thing, the economist said, this is great. The devil is the government, always, to the economists. And in particular, the devil in the financial context is federal deposit insurance. Because of federal deposit insurance, you have federal regulation of institutions. Because the shadow has financial institutions have no deposit insurance directly, we don't need no stinking regulation. They will know that their money is at risk. And so they'll do everything prudently. Now, this was insane. We knew it was insane. We have lots of videos explaining this process. It's a little bit complicated, so I'll just say it's insane. In fact, the reality is the opposite. Without regulation, the epicenter of these scandals has been consistently in precisely these shadow structures. And June, in particular, has two colleagues who wrote a book explaining how this creates a criminogenic environment that you take partnerships, what used to be partnerships, you get rid of the real partnership limitations so they're not threatened by bankruptcy, personal bankruptcy, when the institution like Bear Stearns or Lehman Brothers fails, right? And they can keep the proceeds in the looting that, again, the Khan explained in enormous detail. So it's a win-win. They don't have to put up with any pesky regulators. Only an economist would claim this is an ideal system. It has been a catastrophe always. June has been explaining a number of these systems in which you also had impunity from the laws. If you were wealthy enough, white enough, powerful enough, nasty enough. So again, back to our restoration plank, we can't go through all of this, seem to succeed, and then just turn it over to another group of robber barons who happen to support, let's say, Democrats. That would be a catastrophe. You mentioned the civil rights amendments. Here's the super brief version of history. After the Civil War, the South did not respond by creating segregation. The South responded to its defeat by creating the Black Codes. And what the Black Codes did was use law, mostly civil, but backed up by criminal law, to recreate slavery, de facto slavery. So the contracts were the same work as done under slavery. And the South denied all civil rights, despite the amendments designed to give civil rights and the vote in particular, such that in overwhelmingly, not in every single district, but overwhelmingly in what had been the Confederacy, essentially blacks had zero political electoral power as soon as the white seditionists, the traitors that the Trump administration is now honoring, got back to power. So we fought the bloodiest by far war in the history of this United States, and the losers won in the end of the day because the white northern politicians wouldn't actually enforce the law and in many cases shared the bigotry against black folks. Now, many members of Congress, Republicans in that era, a party created in substantial part because of concerns about slavery, were outraged at this. And they impeached the President of the United States for violating his oath of office and betraying the Union cause and black people. And of course, this that trial in the Senate failed by essentially one vote, maybe two. It's a little historical murky on whether there was a deal to make sure it wouldn't happen, shared by several senators. Here's the crazy part. There's this book called Profiles in Courage. Famous book that helped very much elevate John F. Kennedy to President of the United States. You know who the big heroes are? The centerpiece of the book? The senator that voted to save what had been the Vice President, Andrew Johnson, elevated to the presidency by the traitorous murder of the President of the United States through assassination. That was his big hero. The people that made the Constitution fail. And then the Supreme Court followed that as well. And you know what they called the Republicans who had the audacity to want things to actually be enforced in the Constitution? They called them the radical Republicans. Think of the historical similarities. So anybody that really wants the restoration of the rule of law and democracy and rule by the people as opposed to by the worst of the robber barons, in that era, they were big slaveholders who had all the political power and completely dominated every Confederate state. And their opponents were radical, so you shouldn't listen to them.
Well, go
I'd
ahead.
like to, can I jump in on this? I
Absolutely.
think to bring it back into the present, we have to be clear who the radicals are. The current Republican Party is dramatically more radical than the radical Republicans of the post-Civil War era. And we have some resistance. We have grand juries in Los Angeles refusing to indict people who've been accused of attacking ICE agents. Why? Because there's felt they didn't attack ICE agents. The charges against them were made up. Uh, the saying is you can indict a ham sandwich. Well, they couldn't. The juries refused, and I'm hoping DC juries will do the same. But
Because
I
of
want to
obvious
focus.
lies by the
Yes,
ICE agents.
I want to focus on the victims. And so one of the things when we look at Epstein, and I simply want to note a couple of rumors. One in the newspapers in the UK is that there are cellmates of Ghislaine Maxwell, who said she was bragging she had the goods on Trump during the Biden administration and was angling for a pardon with Biden. Biden, of course, didn't go there. But where there's smoke, there's usually fire. It is said that Epstein abused 1,000 women. We don't know publicly of 1,000 women. And we want to ask the question, Where are the women who would accuse Trump? Now, first, you would expect, if the suspicions are true, there are a lot of them, and there are some. And I want to emphasize what has happened to the ones we know about. So in the 2016 election, before the election, there was a woman, Katie Johnson, who alleged that Trump raped her when she was 13. She filed a lawsuit on her own. She didn't have a lawyer. She filed a lawsuit in California. It ended up being dismissed. She got a lawyer. She filed a lawsuit in New York. She withdrew it shortly before the election. Why? Because she was terrified. She was getting death threats. She was being harassed. Her lawyer held a press conference to say he didn't know where she was. She wouldn't answer his phone calls. He had no way to contact her. When you look at the history of Trump's relationship with women, and you only have to listen to E. Jean Carroll's stories, we're talking about Trump sicking his supporters on these women. We are talking about countersuits for libel. We are talking about death threats. We are talking about all kinds of harassment where your relatives get fired, not just you. When you look at E. Jean Carroll, she was a professional. There's one incident with Trump. She had a lawyer trained at one of the big firms, the kind of big firms Trump is going after in New York, by the way. But when you look at Epstein's MO and Trump's MO and the people he hired in the spa at Mar-a-Lago, it is underage girls who are runaways or whose, parent died or who have no means of support, who are incredibly vulnerable. This is people that Maxwell targeted and groomed. Then you cut them off from support. You make them feel good about themselves. They're getting things and benefits they don't otherwise have. And at the point when they want to blow the whistle or they want to leave, they're stuck. And that doesn't end, even if they succeed in distancing themselves from Epstein or from Trump, they're still vulnerable. We have not, as a society, the DA's offices have not, as institutions, protected those who would come forward. A large part of what the Me Too movement was about were women who did, you look at the predators, you look at people like Harvey Weinstein. There were women who came forward. They went to the Southern District of New York, and the Southern District of New York said, hey, you're some kind of nobody starlet. I can't bring this case. They got no protection. They were threatened. And only when you had movie stars come out and you had a chorus of people come out was there protection. But the people who are Epstein's victims and Trump's victims, if we believe the couple of people who have come forward publicly, are incredibly vulnerable. And they're traumatized by their experiences. They don't have lawyers. They have lawyers if, they've gotten together as a group or somebody is representing them on a pro bono basis. And we have done nothing to investigate their claims or to protect them, except once it becomes a political scandal. So, Comey, the daughter, did bring the case against Epstein and against Maxwell in New York, only at the point where it exploded into public consciousness. But there has been no full investigation, and there are lots of rumors going around. And all I can say is the conspiracy theorists are there on the right. We should, where there's smoke at least, join them. And, the latest on the Midas touch is that there is some kind of sealed indictment of Epstein that hasn't been made public because he committed suicide, but it would lay out more of the details of what the investigators had gathered against him. I mentioned the cellmate, and it's a British publication that has gone with it. It's gotten almost no traction in the United States. And there are certain reporters who have investigated Trump for years who are saying publicly they think he's a child rapist. Now, do they have evidence? They have evidence he has committed sexual assault. They have allegations that he abused underage women. Where are the investigations? Where are the calls? The right has no trouble labeling people awful things with no evidence. We've got a whole lot of evidence here. There should be calls for an investigation. But this leads to the point with which I started. You have a man who is President of the United States, who is, without doubt, a convicted fraudster, a liar, has committed sexual assault, bragged about it on tape, serial abuser of legal process, of his employees, of the legal system, of everyone he can rip off. He is a discredit to the office. And we need to say that. You know who's saying that? Russian TV. What is Russian TV doing? It's posting naked pictures of Melania. They were on the web in the US in the 2016 election too. But they don't treat him as a serious head of state. They treat him as a joke. And we should be emphasizing. So does Vladimir Putin.
Well, wow, this is, go ahead, Bill.
And in the modern era, our field, law, some of the most respected lawyers in the world have allied themselves with ex-intelligence agency personnel with sophisticated devices which they're able to surreptitiously plant on the whistleblowers and the victims of the sex crimes to find out which reporters they're talking to so that they could then threaten those reporters and their publications to try to discredit these things.
Mm-hmm.
And a same group that works in elections to attack George Soros, who is Hungarian ethnically, on the grounds basically that he's pro-democracy and that he's Jewish, which is their, obviously fake grounds to be opposed to somebody. But here's the crazy thing. Most of these key intelligence folks that form the unit, these private for hire groups, and run them, they're ex-Mossad, right? Attacking George Soros on behalf of an anti-Semitic Hungarian leader. Well, they did the same thing to the women.
Mm-hmm.
And then they did the same thing to the whistleblower in the Theranos case. And this is the truly insane part. They were indirectly aided by the grandfather of the key whistleblower in the Theranos case. Schultz, our former Secretary of State, assisted this slimeball CEO fraudster and this once great American attorney gone bad and specializing. He was the Weinstein defense, arranging this attack on the women. And then using a grandfather to attack his grandson, where the grandson was telling the truth and the grandfather was helping to cover up this incredible fraud that wasn't just costing billions of dollars to investors, that actually threatened to kill people that used its services. I don't mean that they threatened with a gun. I mean that their fraud, their medical fraud, would inevitably lead to people dying if their product was marketed on any major basis. That's how insane the world has become because of the idea
Mm-hmm.
that the robber barons should rule. And if you can make more
Mm-hmm.
bucks, well, you'd be a fool. If you were Dershowitz, not to join on these trips, right? Hey, how else is an incredibly ugly old prof going to end up with incredibly pretty young teenagers and such, and other such folks? So it has every aspect of human depravity brought together by this incentive for money and power. And it's age old what people with money and power do. Again, it's what Bastiat warned about when men in society, powerful men in society, get together. What they do is create laws that allow them to abuse with impunity and a moral code that glorifies their predation.
And so the left and right agree. There's a grand conspiracy run by hidden oligarchs who are the puppet masters who are calling the shots. And Epstein is, the tip of the spear in terms of, pun intended, in terms of the abuses that are taking place, and the powerless are the victims. But Trump, Trump is enabler in chief, and we ought to treat him as that, as somebody who, well, we don't know the particulars. We know has been found by a jury to have committed sexual assault, who has been found to have committed fraud, who is the most corrupt president in U.S. history and is not even trying to hide it, and who is selling out the U.S. and our allies to the Russians, whether he realizes it or not.
Well, I was a little concerned coming into this that I was, going to miss our compadres, the rest of the new untouchables, and hello to Paul Peltier, who called in right before saying he couldn't make it, and of course our friend and colleague Mark Dan, who is in the process of undergoing soon heart surgery, and others that have joined us. But this was an incredibly powerful and profound dialogue. I just want to kind of close here with a couple of thoughts to try to bring this all together in my mind, particularly as the producer of The Con, that you guys can all find at thecon.tv. Because what Bill and June alluded to this entire time, and what we've talked about for months in these new Untouchable episodes, is that the Supreme Court has called for, if you're going to prove quid pro quo, or if quid pro quo is going to be, in a situation to where you can hold, the people involved accountable, you have to have the investigation. Where's the investigation going to come from in the event that the entire system has been collapsed of its integrity, which is what we're talking about? I've always said corruption births and fuels fascism. Okay, authoritarianism, whatever. Same as it ever was, like you guys have said throughout its history. But a couple of things to consider in this, and I couldn't stop thinking about this when you were talking about, well, actually, both of you, but Bill, in terms of kind of the Civil War era, and as you both talked about, the perversion, and that's what the through line is here, the perversion of power. It's always the perversion of power. I mean, that's what Jim Crow is, right? That's what the North relented and allowed the South to win, the perversion of a victory. Quite frankly, it wasn't an absolute victory. They just went right back to what shadow slavery, I guess, is what we could call it. A couple of things that I was interested in as you were going through that. I learned from the 1619 Project, and I'm aware that there's a lot of controversy around certain things, but I was shocked to learn, from the predation of sharecropping, but into the collateralized debt obligations and a lot of these sophisticated sort of financial instruments that I thought were innovation circa 1999 to create the great financial crisis. These things had, in some capacity, had already been implemented, and quite frankly, before the Great Depression as well, right? When we learn these lessons, we continue to move forward. But again, without the whistleblowers, without the courage, without the investigation, without allies that are able to bring these truths to light, without a declaration that the law is dead, without a realization of actual reality, can we then try to turn the tables, which is the fight platform and, of course, the restore the platform. all of the elements are there. But what I'm trying to close with is sort of to urge the viewers and all of those that we get this to, that there is no time. The time has run out. It is time to ally, to find like-minded people who understand the importance, because of history, of democracy and the rule of law. Because without it, we know from history, devastation follows. And how far we're away from that at the moment. What's your level of tolerance? I've seen some pretty horrific things over the course of the last several decades. How bad can it get? I guess your imagination can only go there. But I will say this in closing, Bill and June. It was kind of interesting. As a producer, I put on my imaginary hat, and I think, like, Hollywood always comes up with a fun solution. Like, I love Quentin Tarantino films. He did a film called Django, so there was like some make believe brilliant, kind of justice that came from that. But what it illuminated, again, in that sort of fictional structure, was what we as Americans really believe in context of liberty and justice for all, and that the evil that we fought in the American Revolution, in the Civil War, the war against fascism, the civil rights violations, it's now our turn, and it's time to move now. So on that note, guys, please check out the con at thecon.tv. Please check out the New Untouchables at thenewuntouchables.com. As always, check out the Clean New Deal at thecleannewdeal.org. And if you have any questions, please drop them in here. I'll get it to these guys. And thank you so much for your time, your wisdom as always, and your patriotism. Without you guys, I think we'd all be lost. So thank you. Have a wonderful weekend, and all the best to you and your family. Take care.
Thank you.